You've seen this before. A person says something shallow, aggressive, even obviously wrong, and somehow the whole room bends around them, not because they're right, not because they're wise, but because they move faster than doubt. They speak with the confidence you reserve for things you've actually examined. They accuse before you finish thinking. They simplify what is complex. They turn discomfort into authority. And if you are the thoughtful one, the self-aware one, the person who notices the contradiction, something strange happens. You become the one explaining. You become the one softening your tone, adding context, accounting for nuance, trying not to sound arrogant, trying not to hurt anyone, trying to be fair. And while you are doing all of that, they are already winning the social moment. Maybe you felt this your whole life. You weren't defeated by superior intelligence. You were trapped by inferior motives used without hesitation. Schopenhauer understood this long before social media, office politics, or performative outrage. He knew that human beings are not ruled by reason first. They are ruled by will. Blind, insecure, hungry, self-protective will. And once you see that, everyday behavior begins to look very different. This isn't about hating people. It's about seeing clearly. This isn't cynicism. It's precision. And here's what most people never realize. Today, I'm going to show you something uncomfortable. Not why foolish people exist. That part is obvious. Not why some people are manipulative. You already know that. The real question is harder. Why do intelligent people so often lose to them? Why does the most perceptive person in the room end up cornered by the least reflective? Why does the person with the clearest understanding so often walk away exhausted, while the more careless person walks away dominant? Schopenhauer would say the answer is simple, but not pleasant. Human beings like to imagine that reason governs behavior, that logic leads and emotion follows, that truth, presented clearly enough, will correct distortion. But that is not how most people live. Most people live from impulse first, self-protection second, and rationalization third. Reason often arrives late, not to discover truth, but to defend desire that changes everything, because once reason becomes a servant instead of a ruler, intelligence is no longer enough. In fact, intelligence can become a liability if it is tied to fairness, guilt, and the need to be understood. The person who needs truth may lose to the person who only needs advantage. This isn't about hating people. It's about pattern recognition. This isn't rage. It's structure. And if you watch carefully, you'll start seeing the same 7 tricks everywhere. Here's the first reason, Chapter 1. Noise beats nuance. The first manipulation trick is brutally simple. They replace accuracy with force. Not physical force, social force. They speak before thinking. They interrupt before you finish. They answer complexity with slogans. They use tone as a weapon and certainty as camouflage. And because most social environments reward immediacy, that performance often looks like strength. You've seen this in meetings. The least thoughtful person speaks first, frames the issue in the simplest possible way, and suddenly everyone else is reacting to their version of reality. Not because it's correct, because it is now the loudest available structure. And what do intelligent people do? They pause. They consider exceptions. They weigh consequences. They hear the hidden variables. They try to be accurate, not theatrical. But in live social space, hesitation is often misread as weakness. Thoughtfulness looks unsure beside the shameless confidence of someone who has mistaken volume for truth. Schopenhauer saw something essential here. The will does not wait for reason to finish its work. It pushes forward, it asserts, it wants, it protects itself. And many people experience this inner pressure so strongly that they confuse intensity with legitimacy. That is why a shallow person can dominate a conversation with almost no substance at all. The content is not the main event. The force is look at social media. The most balanced voice is rarely the one that spreads fastest. The post that travels is the one that reduces a complicated situation into an emotionally satisfying sentence. Certainty moves, nuance stalls, performance beats reflection. The crowd calls this clarity. Often it is just compression. Or think about family dynamics. One relative speaks dramatically, acts offended first, raises the emotional temperature, and suddenly everyone begins adapting to them. The person who is actually trying to speak carefully becomes too serious, too cold, or too much. Why? Because the room is no longer evaluating truth. It is managing tension. This is where smart people make a fatal mistake. They believe the conversation is still about content. It isn't. It is about frame. It is about tempo. It is about whose emotional rhythm becomes the room's rhythm. And the foolish person often wins because they are willing to simplify what should not be simplified. They cut through reality with a blunt instrument and call it confidence. Meanwhile, you are still holding a scalpel in a room that rewards hammers. Here's the part that stings. Being right too slowly can look like being wrong. Not morally. Socially, that does not mean you should become loud, crude, or intellectually dishonest. It means you must stop assuming that truth announces itself automatically. It doesn't. In human groups, truth often enters quietly. Illusion arrives amplified. Takeaway. In social life, confidence is often believed before truth is even heard. Chapter 2. They turn your intelligence into self-defense. The second trick is subtler. They make you explain yourself until your intelligence starts serving them. This is one of the oldest manipulations in human relationships. You notice a pattern, a lie, a contradiction, a boundary being crossed. You say it plainly. And instead of addressing the thing itself, the other person drags you into procedure. What exactly do you mean? That's unfair. Why would you assume that? Can you prove it? You're overthinking. You always make everything complicated. Now you are no longer naming reality. You are defending your right to have noticed it. This is the trap. A foolish manipulator often cannot outthink you. But they do not need to. They only need to make clarity expensive. They only need to turn your perception into labor. So you begin clarifying. You add examples. You adjust your tone. You try to be precise. Then more objections appear, not because the person is searching for truth, but because endless explanation drains authority. The longer you justify what was obvious from the start, the weaker you appear within the social frame. This happens in dating all the time. Someone is inconsistent, emotionally evasive, available only when it suits them. You mention it once directly. Suddenly you are in a 2-hour conversation about your expectations, your sensitivity, your timing, your wording, your assumptions. By the end, nothing has been resolved. But the original issue has disappeared under a mountain of explanation. It happens in workplaces too. A manager behaves unfairly. You point to the pattern. Instead of correction, you get meetings, emails, clarifications, tone management, context, process, optics. The substance is buried beneath administrative fog. Why does this work so well on intelligent people? Because intelligent people are often vulnerable to coherence. If they can make the conversation look incomplete, you will try to complete it. If they can make the picture look complicated, you will try to organize it. If they can force you into precision, you will keep providing it long after they stopped arguing in good faith. Schopenhauer would not be surprised. He knew that argument is rarely a pure search for truth. Very often it is a contest of self-preservation. People defend position, identity, status, and emotional comfort. Reason is called in afterward like a lawyer. And once you see that, something becomes obvious. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every request for explanation is sincere. Not every confusion is innocent. Sometimes the person asking for more clarity is not confused at all. They are buying time. They are tiring you out. They are trying to make your certainty look obsessive and their evasiveness look reasonable. This is where everything changes. The intelligent person matures the moment they learn the difference between explanation and surrender. You do not owe infinite language to people committed to misunderstanding you. Say less, notice more. Repeat less than they expect, takeaway. The person who forces endless explanation is often trying to control the frame, not understand the truth. Chapter 3. Guilt is their shortcut to control if noise does not work, and confusion does not work. Many manipulators reach for something even more effective. Guilt, this is one of the most powerful weapons against intelligent people. Because intelligent people usually have a conscience. They can imagine the other side. They can see unintended consequences. They do not want to be cruel. They do not want to become arrogant, dismissive, or hard. And that makes them vulnerable. Because the foolish manipulator often understands one thing instinctively. If they cannot defeat your argument, they can attack your self-image. They can make your perception feel morally ugly. They can turn your accuracy into an accusation against your character. You say, "That was dishonest." They respond, "Wow, I didn't know you thought so little of me." You say, "I need distance from this dynamic." They respond, "So when people need you, you disappear." You say, "That story doesn't add up." They respond, "You always think you're smarter than everyone. Do you see the move?" They do not answer the content. They convert the issue into a moral portrait of you. Now, the conversation is no longer about what happened. It is about whether you are kind, loyal, patient, forgiving, emotionally safe, and because you do care about those things, you begin softening. You begin doubting. You begin wondering whether your clarity has become cruelty. This is especially common in families. A parent crosses boundaries for years, then frames your refusal as disrespect. A sibling behaves irresponsibly, then calls your distance coldness. At the family dinner table, the person who names the dysfunction becomes the disturbance, because systems prefer comfort to truth. The one who sees clearly often inherits the guilt of the whole room. Schopenhauer wrote about compassion, but he also understood how suffering can become theatrical, how weakness can become manipulative, how misery can demand not understanding but submission. There is a difference between genuine vulnerability and strategic helplessness. One asks to be met. The other asks to rule by making refusal look immoral. And here's what most people miss. Guilt works best on the person least likely to deserve it. The shameless rarely feel it. The manipulative can weaponize it precisely because they are not governed by it. But you are. That's the asymmetry. Your conscience becomes their leverage. So what do? You learn a colder form of kindness. You stop treating every emotional reaction as sacred evidence. You stop assuming that someone feeling hurt means you have done harm. Hurt can be real and still be manipulative. Tears can be sincere and still be used. Pain does not automatically equal innocence. That realization unsettles people. It should. But without it, smart people remain easy to steer, not by truth, by moral pressure, takeaway. Many people cannot refute your perception, so they punish you for having it. Chapter 4, Confusion, is a form of power. The fourth trick is one of the most draining because it rarely looks like strategy. It looks like chaos, contradictions, reversals, emotional volatility, selective memory, sudden tenderness after cruelty, sudden outrage after agreement. Facts denied today that were admitted yesterday. Promises made sincerely, then broken casually. A tone that changes every time you think you've finally understood the situation. Most people will call this dysfunction. Sometimes it is. But even dysfunction can become power, because confusion exhausts the mind that is trying to map reality. You see this in unstable relationships. One day you are valued. The next, you are accused. You try to identify the pattern, but the pattern keeps moving. Every attempt to establish clarity triggers a different version of events. Soon you're no longer living in truth. You're living in reaction, and reaction is weakness. Schopenhauer's view of human nature was not flattering. He did not believe consciousness had civilized us nearly as much as we like to think. Beneath language and etiquette, there is still impulse, appetite, insecurity, fear. That is why some people create disorder, not because they planned every move consciously, but because disorder serves them instinctively. If confusion protects them from accountability, they will keep producing it. Look at bad leadership. A manager gives vague instructions, changes priorities, blames others for unclear outcomes, then acts irritated when the team cannot stabilize. Is this incompetence? Often, yes. But notice the side effect. Nobody can pin responsibility down. Everyone stays off balance. The leader remains central because only they seem to know what the rules are this week. Look at online outrage cycles. A person says something inflammatory, denies the obvious meaning when criticized, reframes their words when convenient, adopts victimhood when cornered, then returns to aggression when sympathy arrives. The content shifts, but the attention remains. Confusion keeps the spotlight alive. Here's what makes this trick devastating for intelligent people. They believe contradiction can be resolved if they examine it carefully enough. So they keep returning to the puzzle. They try to reconcile the versions. They compare statements, remember dates, cross-check tone, search for coherence. But the manipulator is not building coherence with you. They are surviving from moment to moment. You are constructing a map. They are escaping one. This is where you have to become dangerous in a very quiet way. You stop reading chaos as mystery. You stop assuming inconsistency hides complexity. Sometimes inconsistency hides nothing. Sometimes it is simply the absence of principle. Sometimes the confusion is the message. If a person becomes most powerful when nobody can define what they're doing, clarity is not just your preference, it is your defense takeaway. Confusion is often more than dysfunction. It is a social advantage for the person who benefits from your disorientation. Chapter 5. The crowd protects the simplest story. Now we arrive at the fifth manipulation trick. And this is where the problem stops being personal, because the crowd is often part of it, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but very often, groups protect the simplest story, not the truest one. Why? Because groups are not built for depth. They are built for cohesion. A complicated truth creates tension. It forces people to reevaluate loyalties. It threatens the emotional shortcuts that keep social life smooth. A simpler story costs less. It allows everyone to keep their role. It preserves comfort, even when comfort is built on distortion. This is why foolish people often thrive in groups. They offer narratives that are easy to repeat. She's dramatic. He thinks too much. You know how they are. It's not that deep. These phrases do not explain reality. They reduce it to something socially manageable. And once a group accepts the reduction, the intelligent person is in trouble, because now you are not arguing with one manipulator. You are arguing with a social convenience. Think about friendship circles. One person is consistently selfish, but charming enough to keep the mood light. You point out the pattern. Nobody denies it directly, but the room stiffens. Suddenly you are the one making it heavy. Why? Because the group does not want accuracy. It wants continuity. Think about workplaces. A mediocre but socially fluent employee keeps creating subtle damage, but they are easy to joke with, easy to read, easy to place. The more perceptive colleague notices the deeper pattern and becomes a threat, not because they are wrong, but because they disturb the story that keeps the team emotionally organized. Schopenhauer was deeply suspicious of borrowed opinion. He knew that most people do not arrive at beliefs through solitude and examination. They inherit them from atmosphere. They absorb what is repeatable. They align with what is socially survivable. The group offers relief from thinking. In return, it demands conformity of tone, if not always belief. This is why manipulation often succeeds through witnesses, not just perpetrators. The fool does not need to be persuasive in any profound sense. They only need to be easier to stand beside than you are, easier to defend, easier to summarize, easier to keep around without forcing anyone to question themselves. And here is the brutal truth. The crowd often interprets emotional simplicity as innocence. The more articulate person looks dangerous simply because they can name more, is threatening to people who survive by surface. So what do? First, you stop expecting groups to reward precision on principle. Some will. Most won't. Second, you stop measuring your sanity by consensus. A room agreeing on a lie does not convert it into truth. It only reveals what the room needs. This is where many people lose themselves. They start editing their perception just to stay included. They trade clarity for belonging. They call it maturity. Often it is surrender, takeaway. The crowd rarely asks who is right first. It asks who is easiest to stand beside. Chapter 6. Smart people hesitate because they see. More, here's what most people miss. The reason intelligent people often lose these games is not that they are weak. It is that they are burdened by vision. They see more angles, more consequences, more ambiguity, more humanity, more context, more ways they themselves could be mistaken. That is not a flaw in the moral sense. It is a higher form of perception. But inside manipulative environments, it creates friction, and manipulation hates friction. The foolish person says the thing, the intelligent person thinks about whether it is fair. The foolish person accuses. The intelligent person wonders whether the accusation could escalate harm. The foolish person claims certainty. The intelligent person tests for error. One moves like a blade. The other moves like a compass. In a healthy environment, that depth becomes wisdom. In a distorted environment, it gets exploited. This is why some of the smartest people you know appear strangely passive in conflict. They are not passive because they lack insight. They are passive because they feel too much of the structure at once. They can see the downstream damage. They can imagine the misunderstanding. They know that one sentence can rearrange an entire relationship. And because they know this, they hesitate. Meanwhile, the manipulative person enjoys an ugly advantage. They are not slowed by conscience in the same way. Schopenhauer would say consciousness is not pure power. Sometimes it is suffering. To see clearly is to carry more. To perceive deeply is to feel the weight of contradiction more acutely. The fool is often faster not because they are stronger, but because less is happening inside them. That is why intelligence without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. You keep granting complexity to people who are offering none. You keep interpreting carelessly delivered harm through the most generous available lens. You keep assuming depth on the other side because depth exists in you. And so you walk into the same trap again and again, expecting self-awareness from people organized entirely around appetite, insecurity, and image. This is the part that changes everything. You do not need to become cruel. You do not need to become cynical. But you do need to stop confusing your own depth with a universal human baseline. Not everyone is reflecting the way you reflect. Not everyone is wrestling with motives, contradictions, and unintended harm. Some people are simply moving toward advantage and then inventing explanations afterward. Once you understand that, your hesitation becomes more disciplined. You still think carefully, but you no longer think on behalf of people committed to not thinking at all. Takeaway: Your intelligence becomes a weakness only when you offer its full depth to people who operate without depth. Chapter 7. The moment you stop needing their permission, so what is the answer? Not domination, not revenge, not becoming louder than the loud, not turning cold for the pleasure of it. The answer is more difficult and more unsettling. You stop needing irrational people to validate your clarity. This is the Schopenhauerian turn. The movement away from the crowd, away from constant explanation, away from the exhausting fantasy that if you just say it one more time, one more way, the other person will finally meet reality. Maybe they won't, maybe they can't. Or worse, maybe they can. But they have no incentive to. That realization is painful because it means many conflicts are not unresolved due to lack of communication. They are unresolved because one side benefits from fog. And once you see that, your behavior changes. You stop over-explaining boundaries. You stop translating basic respect into 10 different emotional dialects. You stop entering arguments whose real purpose is to turn your perception into labor. You stop trying to look harmless to people who only respect force. You stop volunteering depth where shallowness has already declared the rules. This is not bitterness. It is conservation. You begin to understand the power of strategic silence. Not silence born from fear, but silence born from recognition. The kind that says, I see what this is and I refuse to feed it. I will not wrestle with distortion for the privilege of being called fair by those who survive through unfairness. In practical life, this looks simple. At work, you document instead of debating. In family systems, you reduce exposure instead of giving speeches. In dating, you leave earlier when the pattern is clear. In friendship, you stop confusing history with trust. Online, you stop mistaking visibility for meaning. You protect your attention like territory, and something strange happens when you do. The manipulator often becomes more frantic. Why? Because many of their tactics depended on your participation, your explanations, your guilt, your attempts to restore coherence, your willingness to keep entering the maze. Once you stop, the machinery loses power. The trick can only function if you keep proving you are not what they implied you were. But you don't have to. This is where solitude becomes medicine. Schopenhauer valued solitude not because he hated humanity in some theatrical sense, but because distance restores proportion. Away from the noise, your own perceptions return to you. You hear your own mind again. You remember that confusion was proof of your failure. It was often evidence of their method. Solitude clarifies what crowds blur. And from that clarity comes a new kind of strength. Not the strength of performance, but the strength of non-cooperation. You become harder to manipulate because you are no longer desperate to be seen as good by people who call every boundary cruelty. You are no longer eager to be understood by people committed to misreading you. You are no longer willing to light your intelligence on fire just to keep someone else warm. This is the deeper lesson. Smart people are often told that their task is to become more patient, more empathetic, more understanding. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the real task is the opposite, to become more exact, more discerning, more willing to offend distorted systems by refusing to submit to them. You do not need to shout to have power. You do not need to perform certainty to possess clarity. You do not need the crowd to confirm what your nervous system already knows. Here's the final truth. Many manipulators seem strong only because you are still trying to solve them. The moment you stop treating them like a puzzle and start treating them like a pattern, your power returns. Not because the world becomes fair, but because you do. Takeaway. The moment you stop needing to be understood by the irrational, you become far harder to control. So this was never really about intelligence versus stupidity. That framing is too flattering, too simple, too emotional. This is about structure. It is about what happens when will exploits conscience, when noise exploits depth, when confusion exploits the mind that still believes contradictions must hide meaning, when the crowd rewards the easiest story over the truest one, when guilt becomes a leash for the person most capable of reflection. And if you have lived through this, you know the deepest damage is not always external. It is internal. You begin to doubt your own perception. You begin to explain yourself before you've even been accused. You begin softening truths that once felt obvious. You become careful in places where someone else remains reckless. Over time, that imbalance changes your posture toward life. That is why clarity matters. Not because clarity makes you invincible, it won't. Not because clarity removes pain, it doesn't. But because clarity ends the most expensive illusion of all, the illusion that every conflict can be solved through enough honesty, enough patience, enough language, enough goodwill. Some conflicts persist because one side feeds on distortion. Once you understand that, you become calmer, colder, maybe, but not emptier, more precise, more selective, less available to nonsense dressed as complexity, less interested in defending your mind to people who weaponize misunderstanding, more willing to let certain rooms misjudge you if the price of acceptance is self-betrayal. That is not cynicism. It is precision. That is not rage. It is structure. And that is not withdrawal from reality. It is your return to it. The world is full of people who will call your clarity arrogance, your distance cruelty, your boundaries pride, your silence weakness. Let them. Not every accusation deserves a trial. Not every performance deserves your attention. And not every mind deserves access to yours. If this resonated, comment one word: clarity. Then try something difficult this week. Notice one moment where you begin over-explaining yourself to someone committed to not understanding, and stop. Just stop. Hold the silence. Keep the boundary. Let the discomfort teach you who is feeding on your confusion.